Eleanor Whitmore's first impression of Birch Hollow was the smell. It wasn't just coal dust, though that was everywhere, coating windowsills and settling into the creases of every face. It was the smell of damp wood, unwashed bodies pressed together in cramped company housing, and something else she couldn't quite name. Desperation, perhaps. The kind that seeps into a place when hope becomes a luxury no one can afford. Her uncle's clinic was a converted storefront on Main Street, wedged between a general store and a saloon that never seemed to close. The building leaned slightly to the left, as if tired of standing upright. Inside, the waiting room was already full by the time they arrived that first morning. Miners with mangled hands wrapped in dirty cloth, women holding feverish children, an old man coughing blood into a handkerchief he'd long stopped trying to hide. Dr. Whitmore moved through them with practiced efficiency, his face betraying nothing. Eleanor watched him work, how he never quite met anyone's eyes, how he prescribed laudanum for pain he couldn't fix, and sent people home with instructions they couldn't follow. Rest, he'd say. Stay out of the mine for a week. As if they had a choice. As if missing a week's wages wouldn't mean their families went hungry. She began helping without asking permission, cleaning wounds properly, talking to the patients, learning their names, their stories. There was Margaret Chen, whose husband had died in a collapse 3 years prior, now raising 4 children while taking in laundry. There was Samuel Brooks, a 14-year-old boy who'd lost 2 fingers in the sorting machinery and still reported to work each morning because his mother was sick. There was Ruth Hendricks, pregnant with her 5th child, her face grey with exhaustion that went deeper than lack of sleep. Eleanor started keeping records, not the sparse notes her uncle made, name, symptom, treatment, but real records. She documented the patterns she saw, the lung disease that affected nearly every miner over 40, the injuries that happened with disturbing regularity in certain sections of the mine, the children who came in malnourished, their parents working 12-hour shifts for wages that barely covered rent in the company housing. By summer, she'd filled 3 notebooks. By fall, she'd started asking questions that made people uncomfortable. Why were safety inspections always scheduled weeks in advance, giving the company time to make temporary fixes? Why did injured workers get dismissed rather than compensated? Why were company store prices so inflated that families went into debt buying necessities? Her uncle warned her to stop. This isn't Charleston, Eleanor. People here don't ask questions. They survive. But Eleanor had never been good at staying quiet. She'd grown up watching her father, a labor organizer, fight for workers' rights in the city. She'd seen what collective action could accomplish. She believed that even here, in this forgotten corner of Appalachia, people deserved dignity. She started small. She convinced the general store owner, Mr. Peterson, to extend credit to families the company store had blacklisted. She organized a group of miners' wives to collectively negotiate with the company for better housing conditions. She wrote letters to newspapers in Charleston and Huntington detailing the conditions she witnessed. Most of her letters went unanswered. The one that didn't came from a journalist named Robert Thorne. He'd been investigating labor conditions across West Virginia and found Eleanor's accounts compelling. He wanted to visit Birch Hollow, to document what she'd described, to bring attention to what the Consolidated Coal Company was doing. Eleanor wrote back immediately. She gave him specific dates, names, evidence she'd compiled. She told him about the company's practice of paying in scrip rather than real money, trapping workers in perpetual debt. She told him about the safety violations she'd witnessed, the corner cutting that put men's lives at risk daily. She told him everything. She didn't know that the postmaster, a man named Vernon Pike, steamed open letters that seemed suspicious. She didn't know that Pike reported directly to Walter Gaines, the mine superintendent. She didn't know that her correspondence with Thorne had been documented, copied, and delivered to the company's main office before it ever reached Charleston. By December 1896, Eleanor Whitmore had become a problem, not a small problem. Those could be managed with intimidation or bribery. She was a problem that required a solution, and in Birch Hollow, solutions to problems often came in forms that left no witnesses and even fewer questions. Winter arrived early that year, bringing snow that covered the mountains in white silence. Eleanor continued her work, unaware that she was being watched, that every conversation was being noted, that plans were being made. She believed she was helping people. She believed that truth mattered, that justice could prevail. She was wrong about many things, but she was right about one. Her death would change Birch Hollow forever. January 1897 brought cold that settled into bones and refused to leave. The mine operated at reduced capacity, ice made the slopes treacherous, equipment froze overnight, and even the most desperate workers found excuses to avoid the deepest shafts. Eleanor used the slower pace to expand her work. She'd begun teaching in the evenings, helping miners' children learn to read and write in the back room of the clinic. Her uncle disapproved but said nothing. Dr. Whitmore had learned that arguing with Eleanor was like arguing with weather, pointless and exhausting. Besides, he'd grown dependent on her help. She was better with patients than he'd ever been, had a way of making people trust her that went beyond medical skill. It was during one of these evening classes that Eleanor met James Cunningham properly. She'd seen him around town, a mine foreman in his early 30s, tall and lean with hands scarred from years underground. Unlike most foremen, who served as extensions of company authority, James seemed genuinely concerned about the men working under him. He'd been the one to carry Samuel Brooks out after the boy lost his fingers, had paid for the doctor visit from his own pocket when the company refused. He appeared at the clinic one Wednesday evening, his 9-year-old nephew Thomas in tow. "Miss Whitmore," he said, removing his cap. "Heard you were teaching reading. Thomas here is bright, but the company school only runs 3 months a year. Thought maybe." Eleanor smiled. "Of course. Bring him Thursday evenings." But James stayed that first night, watching from the doorway as Eleanor worked with the children. She taught them letters by having them write their own names first, their families' names, words that mattered to them. She taught them numbers using real problems, calculating fair wages, measuring distances, understanding debt. She made education feel relevant, urgent, necessary. After the children left, James lingered. "You're making enemies," he said quietly. "I'm making friends too." "The enemies are more dangerous." He paused, choosing words carefully. "Walter Gaines has been asking about you. About your letters, your records. You need to be careful." Eleanor met his eyes. "Are you warning me or threatening me?" "Warning. God help me. I'm warning you." He put his cap back on. "There are things happening here you don't understand. The company doesn't just own the mine, it owns everything. The land, the buildings, the law. People who cause trouble tend to disappear. Then maybe it's time people stop disappearing quietly." James shook his head, but there was admiration in his expression. "You're either very brave or very foolish. Can't I be both?" That conversation marked the beginning of something neither of them intended. James started coming to the clinic more often, sometimes with legitimate injuries to treat, sometimes with information Eleanor needed. He told her about safety violations he couldn't officially report. He warned her when company inspectors were coming so she could prepare documentation. He became, without either of them saying it aloud, her protector. But protection in Birch Hollow was a fragile thing. In February, Eleanor received word that Robert Thorne, the journalist, was finally coming to visit. He'd arranged to spend a week in town, interviewing workers, documenting conditions, photographing the housing and mine entrances. His newspaper was planning a major expose on labor conditions in West Virginia coal country, and Birch Hollow would be featured prominently. Eleanor was elated. This was exactly what she'd hoped for. Outside attention, public scrutiny, pressure that might actually force change. She spent days preparing, organizing her notes, arranging interviews with workers willing to speak on record. James was less optimistic. "You're poking a bear," he said, "a bear with money and lawyers and friends in the state capital. Then let it wake up. Maybe it needs to be poked." On February 23rd, Robert Thorne arrived on the afternoon train. He was younger than Eleanor expected, maybe 30, with ink-stained fingers and an intensity that reminded her of her father. They met at the clinic, and Eleanor spread out months of documentation. Medical records showing patterns of injury, testimonies from workers, photographs she'd taken of company housing conditions, evidence of wage manipulation. Thorne's eyes widened as he reviewed the materials. "This is incredible. This is exactly what we need. The company won't be able to dismiss this as rumor or exaggeration. They worked through the evening, Eleanor explaining the context behind each piece of evidence. She introduced him to workers who'd agreed to be interviewed, families who'd share their stories. For the first time since arriving in Birch Hollow, Eleanor felt genuine hope that things might change. She didn't notice the man standing in the shadows across the street, watching the clinic windows. She didn't see him leave and head toward the mine superintendent's office. She didn't know that Walter Gaines was holding an emergency meeting with company executives, that telegrams were being sent to Charleston, that decisions were being made. The next morning, Robert Thorne's body was found at the bottom of a ravine 3 miles outside town. The sheriff ruled it an accident. Journalist unfamiliar with mountain roads, icy conditions, tragic but straightforward. The investigation lasted less than a day. Eleanor knew better. She knew, but she couldn't prove it. And in Birch Hollow, knowing without proof was the same as knowing nothing at all. The death of Robert Thorne changed everything and nothing. The town absorbed the tragedy with the same grim acceptance it applied to mining accidents and childhood diseases. One more casualty of life in a place where death was a regular visitor. The Charleston newspaper sent no replacement journalist. The story died with the man who'd come to write it, but Eleanor couldn't let it go. Thorne's death wasn't an accident, and his silence wouldn't be meaningless if she could help it. She threw herself into her work with renewed intensity, documenting everything, preparing for the day when someone else might listen. Her notebooks multiplied. Her records became more detailed. She interviewed workers late at night in secret, gathering testimonies that might someday matter. Dr. Whitmore begged her to stop. "Eleanor, please, they killed that journalist. They'll kill you too if you keep this up. So I should just pretend I don't see what's happening. Let them keep treating people like expendable tools. I'm asking you to survive, that's all. Just survive." But survival felt like complicity, and Eleanor had never been good at accepting injustice quietly. She continued her evening classes, her medical work, her careful documentation. She also continued seeing James Cunningham, though their relationship remained undefined, existing in the spaces between propriety and necessity. James brought her information the company tried to hide. A collapse in Shaft 7 that injured 4 men, officially recorded as equipment malfunction, actually caused by inadequate timber supports, the company refused to replace. A family evicted from company housing after the father missed work recovering from pneumonia. Children as young as 10 working in the sorting facilities, their wages docked for training. In March, Eleanor made a decision that would seal her fate. She started organizing. Not openly, she wasn't that foolish, but carefully, quietly, building networks among the miners' families. She held meetings disguised as church gatherings, taught literacy using pamphlets about workers' rights, connected people who shared common grievances. She found allies in unexpected places. Margaret Chen, the widow who took in laundry, had a sharp mind for organizing collective action. Ruth Hendricks, despite her exhaustion, was fearless when it came to advocating for her children's future. Even some of the miners, men beaten down by years of exploitation, began to believe that change might be possible. They started small, a work slowdown to protest unsafe conditions in Shaft 7, a group refusal to shop at the company store until prices were lowered, women collectively withholding rent until housing repairs were made. Individual actions that, taken together, began to cost the Consolidated Coal Company real money. Walter Gaines noticed. Of course he noticed. Profit margins were shrinking. Production was down. Workers who'd been docile for years were suddenly making demands. And at the center of it all, like a spider in a web, was Eleanor Whitmore. He called her to his office in early April. The mine superintendent's office was the nicest building in Birch Hollow. Brick construction, glass windows, a coal stove that actually kept the place warm. Gaines sat behind a mahogany desk that probably cost more than most miners earned in a year. "Miss Whitmore," he said, not standing when she entered. "I think we need to have a conversation." Eleanor remained standing, hands folded calmly. "I'm listening." "You've been quite active since arriving in our town, teaching, organizing, asking questions. Admirable, really, but also disruptive." "Disruptive to what? To a system that treats human beings like machinery?" Gaines smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're young, idealistic. You think the world can be changed with good intentions and moral outrage. But this is business, Miss Whitmore. This mine employs 300 men. It supports nearly 1,000 people. Without it, Birch Hollow doesn't exist. And with it, people live in poverty while the company profits. They live. That's more than they'd have without the mine." He leaned forward. "I'm going to be direct. Your uncle is a good doctor. We value his services. But you've become a liability. I'm offering you a choice. Leave Birch Hollow voluntarily, with a generous payment for your trouble, or face the consequences of continued interference." Eleanor felt her heart racing but kept her voice steady. "Is that a threat?" "It's a business proposition. Think carefully about your answer." She should have been afraid. Any reasonable person would have been afraid. But Eleanor had spent too many months watching children go hungry, seeing men destroyed by preventable accidents, witnessing systematic exploitation dressed up as economic necessity. Fear felt less important than truth. "I'm not leaving," she said quietly. Gaines studied her for a long moment. "I thought you'd say that." "I'm sorry, Miss Whitmore. Truly sorry. You seem like a decent person. But decent people can't get in the way of progress." Eleanor left his office feeling like she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She told James about the meeting that evening. He listened, his face growing darker with each word. "You need to leave," he said finally. "Tonight. I'll help you pack. Get you to the train station before morning." "I can't leave. These people they need you alive more than they need you here. Eleanor, I've worked for Gaines for 8 years. I know what he's capable of. When he calls someone a liability, they don't stay liabilities long." But Eleanor couldn't run. Running meant abandoning everything she'd built, everyone who'd trusted her. It meant letting fear win. "I'm staying," she said. James grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Then I'm staying with you, every moment. I won't let them." "You can't protect me every second, and if you try, they'll go after you too." "Then let them." It was the closest either of them had come to admitting what existed between them, something more than friendship, deeper than alliance, but there wasn't time to explore it. Time was running out faster than either of them realized. April brought rain that turned Birch Hollow's dirt streets into rivers of mud. The mine operated at half capacity. Flooding in the lower shafts meant constant pumping, and even then some sections remained too dangerous to work. For the miners, it meant reduced wages. For Eleanor, it meant more patients crowding the clinic with pneumonia, infected wounds from working in contaminated water, children with fevers that wouldn't break. She worked 18-hour days, sleeping in the clinic's back room when she slept at all. Dr. Whitmore had grown increasingly distant, avoiding conversations about anything beyond immediate medical necessities. Eleanor knew he was afraid, and she couldn't entirely blame him. Fear was the rational response to their situation. James kept his promise to stay close. He accompanied her everywhere, to the clinic, to her evening classes, even to the boarding house, where she officially maintained a room she rarely used. His presence drew attention and comment. Unmarried men and women weren't supposed to spend time alone together. But Eleanor had stopped caring about propriety months ago. On April 18th, everything accelerated. A cave-in occurred in Shaft 4, trapping 17 men underground. It happened at shift change when the tunnels were most crowded, and the chaos was immediate. James was below ground when it happened. Eleanor heard the alarm bell and ran to the mine entrance with her medical supplies, arriving to find wives and children already gathering, their faces pale with dread they couldn't voice. The rescue took 11 hours. They brought out 14 men alive. 3 bodies remained buried under tons of rock and timber. James emerged covered in coal dust and blood, not his own, his hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. Eleanor treated the injured in a makeshift station near the mine entrance, setting broken bones, stitching gashes, doing what she could with limited supplies and no proper facilities. Walter Gaines arrived around hour 8. He observed the rescue efforts from a safe distance, consulted with engineers, made notes on a clipboard. He didn't speak to the families. He didn't offer comfort or support. He calculated. Later, Eleanor would learn that the collapse had been predicted. Engineers had filed reports about deteriorating support structures in Shaft 4. They'd recommended expensive reinforcement work. The company had decided it was more cost-effective to maintain current operations and accept occasional casualties. 3 men died because replacing timber was expensive. That was the calculation. That was the business model. Eleanor documented everything. She interviewed the survivors, took statements about the conditions they'd been working in, photographed the damaged equipment brought up from below. She gathered evidence of negligence so clear that even company lawyers would struggle to dismiss it. She didn't know that Walter Gaines was watching her document, making his own calculations about liability and risk. She didn't know that a telegram had already been sent to the company's main office in Charleston. Whitmore problem has become critical. Recommend immediate action. That night, exhausted and covered in other people's blood, Eleanor returned to the clinic with James. They sat in the waiting room in silence, too tired for words. Finally, James spoke. "We need to get this evidence out of Birch Hollow. Send it somewhere safe, somewhere the company can't reach." Eleanor nodded. "I've been thinking the same thing. I have a contact in Charleston, a lawyer who worked with my father. If I can get the documentation to him, we'll send it tomorrow, all of it, every record, every photograph, every testimony." James paused. "And then you're leaving, don't argue. I know you don't want to, but this is beyond what one person can fix. You've gathered the evidence. Let others use it to fight the legal battles." For once, Eleanor didn't argue. The day had been too long, the cost too high, the injustice too overwhelming. Maybe James was right. Maybe she'd done all she could do here. Maybe survival wasn't the same as surrender. They spent the next morning carefully packaging Eleanor's documentation, 3 years of records, hundreds of testimonies, photographs, evidence of systematic negligence and exploitation. James arranged for a trusted friend, a railway worker who traveled regularly to Charleston, to hand-deliver the package to Eleanor's contact. The package left on the noon train. Eleanor watched it go, feeling simultaneously relieved and hollow. Without her records, she had no purpose here. Without her purpose, she was just another person trapped in Birch Hollow, watching people suffer while doing nothing. That afternoon, Dr. Whitmore called her into his office. His face was grey, his hands shaking slightly as he poured whiskey into a glass and drank it in one swallow. "They came to see me this morning," he said without preamble. "Gaines and 2 company lawyers. They made things very clear. Either you leave Birch Hollow within 48 hours, or they'll find a reason to arrest you. Trespassing, theft, incitement. They don't care what they charge you with, as long as you're locked up or gone." Eleanor felt cold despite the room's warmth. "And you? What did you tell them?" "I told them you'd be on the next train out." He looked at her, and she saw genuine fear in his eyes. "Please, Eleanor. Please just go. I can't protect you anymore. I don't think anyone can." She wanted to argue, to insist she had rights they couldn't violate. That law still meant something even here. But she'd learned enough about Birch Hollow to know better. Law meant what powerful men said it meant. Rights existed only for those who could afford to defend them. "I'll leave tomorrow," she said quietly. Dr. Whitmore sagged with relief. "Thank God, I'll arrange passage on the morning train. You can stay at the boarding house tonight. I need to say goodbye to some people first, the families I've been working with. They deserve to know I'm leaving." Her uncle started to protest, then stopped. Even he couldn't deny people that much dignity. Eleanor spent the afternoon making careful farewells, telling the families she'd come to know that she was leaving, but that their fight would continue. She gave Margaret Chen contact information for labor organizers in Charleston. She told Ruth Hendricks that her children's education mattered, to keep teaching them no matter what. She promised Samuel Brooks that losing his fingers didn't mean losing his future. James found her at dusk, sitting on the steps of the empty clinic. He sat beside her without speaking, their shoulders touching, and they watched Birch Hollow settle into evening, lights coming on in windows, smoke rising from chimneys, the town preparing for another night of survival. Neither of them saw the men gathering in the shadows. Neither of them knew that Eleanor's departure had come one day too late. Eleanor woke to the sound of breaking glass. For a moment, disoriented in the darkness of the clinic's back room, she thought she'd imagined it. Then she heard voices, low, male, deliberate. She sat up, heart hammering, and reached for the lamp beside her bed. Before her fingers found the matches, the door burst open. 3 men entered, faces covered with bandanas, carrying clubs and rope. Eleanor scrambled backward, opening her mouth to scream, but one of them was faster. A rough hand clamped over her face, another grabbed her arms, and she was dragged from the bed before she could make a sound. They bound her wrists with practiced efficiency, gagged her with cloth that tasted of coal dust and tobacco. She struggled, but they were strong, and she was alone. They hauled her through the clinic's back door into an alley where a wagon waited, its driver's face hidden beneath a hat pulled low. They threw her into the wagon bed like cargo. One of the men climbed in beside her, keeping a hand on her shoulder to prevent movement. The wagon lurched forward, heading away from Main Street, away from the few places in Birch Hollow where someone might notice, might help. Eleanor's mind raced through possibilities. Where were they taking her? What did they plan to do? She thought of James, asleep in his boarding house, unaware. She thought of Dr. Whitmore, who'd probably wake to find her gone and convince himself it was for the best. She thought of all the things she hadn't said, hadn't done, hadn't finished. The wagon travelled for perhaps 20 minutes, following rough roads into the hills beyond town. When it finally stopped, they were deep in forest, surrounded by birch trees that gleamed pale in the moonlight. The men pulled her from the wagon and dragged her toward a clearing where others waited. Walter Gaines stood near a lantern hung from a tree branch. He wasn't hiding his face. He looked at Eleanor with something like regret, but not enough to stop what was happening. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, "I gave you a chance to leave peacefully. You chose not to take it." They removed her gag. Eleanor gasped air, then found her voice. "This is murder. You can't just—" "We're not going to murder you." Gaines gestured to one of the men, who produced a document. "You're going to write a confession. You'll admit to stealing company property, falsifying records and conspiring with outside agitators to damage the Consolidated Coal Company's reputation. You'll apologize, and then you'll leave West Virginia and never return. I won't sign anything. Then we'll hurt people you care about. James Cunningham, for instance, your uncle, Margaret Chen and her children. We'll start with them and work our way through everyone you've ever spoken to." Gaines stepped closer. "Sign the paper, Miss Whitmore. Save them the suffering." Eleanor understood then. They'd thought this through. They had leverage she couldn't fight. If she refused, innocent people would pay the price. If she signed, she'd discredit everything she'd worked for, make herself look like a criminal or a liar. "How do I know you'll leave them alone if I sign?" "You don't. But you know we'll hurt them if you don't." It was an impossible choice, designed to be impossible. Eleanor looked at the document, at the men surrounding her, at Gaines's cold, practical face. She thought about what her father would do, what he'd taught her about standing up to bullies and corrupt systems. Then she made her decision. "No," she said clearly. "I won't sign. Do whatever you're going to do, but I won't give you the satisfaction of making me complicit in my own destruction." Something shifted in Gaines's expression, surprise maybe, or anger. "You're being foolish." "Maybe. But I'm not being a coward." Gaines nodded to the men. "Take her to the old mine shaft, the one that collapsed last year. We'll say she went hiking, got lost, fell in the dark. Another tragic accident. The mountains are dangerous for city girls who don't know better." They dragged her deeper into the forest, away from the clearing, away from any chance of rescue. Eleanor didn't scream. There was no one to hear. She didn't beg, they wouldn't listen. She focused instead on breathing, on staying present, on not giving them the satisfaction of seeing her break. They reached the abandoned mine shaft, a vertical opening in the earth, maybe 15 feet deep, its bottom hidden in darkness. The men positioned her at the edge. One of them pulled out a pistol, and for a moment Eleanor thought they were going to shoot her first, make it quick. But Gaines stopped him. "No bullets, no evidence. Push her." Eleanor looked down into the darkness. She thought of all the things she'd never do, never say, never fix. She thought of James, who'd tried to protect her. She thought of the families in Birch Hollow, still trapped in the system she'd failed to break. Then someone shoved her hard between the shoulder blades and she was falling. The impact knocked the air from her lungs. Pain exploded through her body, her left leg, her ribs, her head striking rock. She tried to breathe and couldn't, tried to move and couldn't. Above her she heard voices, footsteps, the sounds of men covering their tracks. Then silence. Eleanor lay in darkness, broken and alone, and understood that this was how she would die. Not quickly, not cleanly, but slowly, in pain, in a hole no one would think to search, the death that would never end, because no one would know where to find her body or how to make peace with her absence. She closed her eyes and waited for the end. But Eleanor Whitmore did not die that night. The fall had broken her left leg, cracked several ribs, and left her with a concussion that made the world swim and blur. But she was conscious, breathing, alive. The shaft was deep enough to hide her from casual view, but shallow enough that the impact, while devastating, wasn't immediately fatal. She drifted in and out of awareness as the night stretched on. Pain was constant, overwhelming, but beneath it was something else, a stubborn refusal to let them win. They'd meant for her to die here quietly, to disappear without explanation. But if she survived, if she somehow got out, their crime would be exposed. That thought kept her conscious through the worst hours. She couldn't move her left leg without agony that made her vision darken. Her ribs screamed with every breath, but her hands still worked. Her mind, though foggy, still functioned. As dawnlight began filtering into the shaft, Eleanor assessed her situation with the same methodical approach she'd brought to everything in Birch Hollow. The walls were rough rock and dirt, offering handholds. The shaft wasn't vertical. It angled slightly, which meant climbing might be possible. Impossible with a broken leg, but possible. She fashioned a splint from her torn skirt and a piece of timber that had fallen into the shaft during the old collapse. The pain of straightening her leg made her scream into the empty forest, but she did it anyway. She bound the splint tight with strips of fabric, creating something that just might support minimal weight. Then she began to climb. It took hours. Every movement was agony. She pulled herself upward using her arms and her good leg, dragging the broken one behind her, stopping frequently to rest when nausea and dizziness threatened to make her fall. Several times she nearly gave up, nearly let herself slide back down to wait for death in the darkness. But she thought of Margaret Chen, raising 4 children alone. She thought of Samuel Brooks, who'd lost fingers but not hope. She thought of all the people in Birch Hollow who couldn't fight back because they had too much to lose. She thought of James, who'd tried to protect her and would blame himself for failing. By mid-afternoon, her fingers found the edge of the shaft. She hauled herself over the lip and collapsed on solid ground, sobbing with relief and pain. She'd made it out. Against impossible odds, she'd survived. But survival wasn't safety. She was miles from town, badly injured, in a forest she didn't know. Gaines and his men thought she was dead, which meant returning to Birch Hollow would put her in immediate danger. She needed help, but from someone she could trust absolutely. Eleanor oriented herself using the sun and began moving downhill, reasoning that water flowed down and people built near water. Every step was torture. Her splinted leg could barely support weight. Her ribs made breathing feel like being stabbed repeatedly. But she moved anyway, one agonizing step at a time. She found a stream by evening and followed it as darkness fell. She didn't dare stop. Stopping meant risking unconsciousness, and unconsciousness out here meant death. So she stumbled forward through the night, leaving a trail of blood from cuts and scrapes, her body running on nothing but will. Dawn of the second day found her at the edge of a small homestead, a cabin with smoke rising from its chimney, chickens in the yard, signs of human habitation. Eleanor made it to the front door and knocked once before her legs gave out and she collapsed on the porch. The woman who opened the door gasped, "Sweet Jesus! Henry! Henry, come quick!" Eleanor tried to speak, to explain, but consciousness was slipping away. The last thing she heard before darkness took her was the woman calling for help, telling someone to fetch the doctor, saying something about that girl from town, the one who helps people. When Eleanor woke, she was in a bed that wasn't hers, in a room she didn't recognize. Every part of her body hurt, but the pain was different now, sharp and immediate, rather than the overwhelming agony of broken bones grinding together. Someone had set her leg properly, wrapped her ribs, cleaned her wounds. An elderly woman sat in a chair beside the bed, knitting. She looked up when Eleanor stirred. "You're awake. Good. You've been out for nearly 2 days. Doctor said it could go either way. Where am I? My home. I'm Catherine Mills. My husband Henry found you on our porch 3 mornings ago, more dead than alive. She set down her knitting. You're Eleanor Whitmore, aren't you? The doctor's niece from town. Eleanor nodded weakly. Thought so. We've heard about you, about the work you've been doing, standing up to the company. Catherine's expression hardened. We've also heard you disappeared. The company's saying you ran off in the night, abandoned your uncle without a word. But I'm guessing that's not what happened, is it? They tried to kill me, Eleanor whispered. They threw me down a mine shaft and left me to die. Catherine nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. The company's been looking for you. Sheriff came by yesterday asking if we'd seen anything unusual. We told him no. You lied for me? Girl, my son died in that mine 15 years ago. Collapse, they said, was an accident, but everybody knew was negligence. I've got no love for the Consolidated Coal Company. She leaned forward. Question is, what do you want to do now? Eleanor spent 5 days at the Mills homestead, hidden in their back bedroom, while her body slowly began to heal. Catherine and Henry were careful, telling neighbors she was a distant cousin visiting from Kentucky. Dr. Whitmore never came. Catherine's husband fetched a doctor from a town 20 miles away, someone who wouldn't report back to the company. During those days, Eleanor learned things about Birch Hollow she hadn't known. Catherine had lived in these mountains for 60 years. She'd watched the coal company arrive, watched it consume the land and the people. She knew things, secrets, patterns, the real history beneath the official version. Your journalist friend, Catherine said one evening while changing Eleanor's bandages. Robert Thorne. He wasn't the first person to disappear asking questions. There was a union organizer in 93, a government inspector in 95. Both of them died in accidents right before they were set to make reports. How many people know this? Most everyone, truth be told, but knowing and proving are different things, and speaking up means risking what little you have. Catherine finished wrapping the bandage. Company owns the law here. Sheriff's on their payroll, judge too. You can't fight them through legal channels. Then how do you fight them? You don't. You survive, you protect your own, and you wait for someone with more power to notice. Catherine paused. Or you become the person who makes them notice. Eleanor understood what Catherine was suggesting. She'd sent her documentation to Charleston, but without her to verify it, to testify to its authenticity, it would be easy for company lawyers to dismiss. She needed to get to Charleston herself, to tell her story publicly where the company couldn't silence her. But first, she needed to know what had happened in Birch Hollow since her disappearance. James came on the 6th day. Catherine's husband had made contact carefully, letting James know where Eleanor was without revealing it to anyone else. He arrived at dusk, riding a borrowed horse, his face haggard with worry and lack of sleep. When he saw Eleanor alive and conscious, something in his expression broke. He knelt beside her bed, taking her hand carefully, as if afraid she might shatter. They told me you'd run away. I knew it was a lie. I knew something had happened, but I couldn't prove anything. They threw me down a mine shaft, left me to die. James's jaw tightened. Gaines and 3 others. I didn't see their faces, but Gaines was there. He gave the order. I'll kill him, You'll do nothing that puts you in danger. Eleanor squeezed his hand. James, I need you to listen. The documentation I sent to Charleston, I need to follow it, to testify in person. But I can't do that if the company knows I'm alive. They'll either kill me properly this time or discredit me so thoroughly that no one will believe my testimony. James was quiet for a moment, thinking. You need to disappear. Completely. Let them think they succeeded. And then? And then we build a case they can't ignore. Not just your testimony, but others willing to speak. Workers who've been too afraid until now, who might find courage if they know someone survived to tell the truth. Over the next week, they planned carefully. James would return to Birch Hollow and quietly make contact with workers willing to testify. He'd document new incidents, gather additional evidence, build on what Eleanor had already compiled. Meanwhile, Eleanor would recover at the Mills homestead, hidden from company attention. But hiding felt like dying slowly. Eleanor was used to action, to doing something, to fighting back. Lying in bed while others took risks on her behalf went against everything she believed. On her 10th day at the homestead, Dr. Whitmore arrived unexpectedly. Catherine tried to turn him away, but he pushed past her, moving with unusual determination. He found Eleanor in the back bedroom and stopped in the doorway, staring at her as if seeing a ghost. "You're alive," he whispered. "No thanks to your friends at the company." He flinched. "Eleanor, I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know they planned to—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "When you disappeared, Gaines told me you'd left town." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him because if I accepted what really happened, then I'd have to admit I'd let them. He sank into a chair, suddenly looking much older. "I'm so sorry." Eleanor studied her uncle, a man she'd once respected, now diminished by his own cowardice. But she also saw genuine remorse and something else. Fear. "Why are you here?" "Because I can't live with what I've let happen. Because you were right about everything, and I was wrong to tell you to stop. Because—" He pulled an envelope from his pocket. "Because I have information you need. About the company, about Gaines, about things even worse than you documented." The envelope contained financial records Dr. Whitmore had been keeping secretly for years, evidence of bribes paid to local officials, documentation of deliberate safety violations, proof that the company had known about dangerous conditions and chosen profit over lives repeatedly. "This is enough," Eleanor said, studying the documents. "This, combined with what I already sent to Charleston, is enough to force a real investigation." "Then let me take it. Let me go to Charleston, make the report." Dr. Whitmore met her eyes. "I can't undo what I've failed to do, but I can do this. They won't suspect me. I'm the company doctor. I'm supposed to be on their side." It was risky. If the company discovered what Dr. Whitmore was doing, they'd stop him the same way they'd stopped Robert Thorne. But he was right. He could move freely in ways Eleanor couldn't. "All right," she said finally, "but you need to be careful. Document everything. Make copies. Send things through different channels so if one package disappears, others survive." Dr. Whitmore nodded. "I'll leave tomorrow. I'll tell them I need to visit suppliers in Charleston, stock up on medical supplies. It'll buy me a few days before they suspect anything." He left at dawn, carrying documentation that could destroy the Consolidated Coal Company's operations in Birch Hollow. Eleanor watched him go, hoping he had the courage to follow through, knowing it might be the last time she saw him alive. 3 weeks passed in tense waiting. Eleanor's leg healed slowly, the bones knitting together under Catherine's careful attention. Her ribs stopped screaming with every breath. The concussion faded, leaving only occasional headaches. Physically, she was recovering. Mentally, the isolation was torture. James visited when he could, always carefully, always watching for company spies. He brought news from Birch Hollow. Dr. Whitmore had returned from Charleston and resumed his normal duties, giving no indication that anything had changed. Gaines continued running the mine with his usual ruthless efficiency. Life in Birch Hollow went on, as if Eleanor Whitmore had never existed. But beneath the surface, things were shifting. James had made quiet contact with workers willing to testify. Margaret Chen had organized a network of miners' wives ready to speak about working conditions. Even some of the foremen, men who'd stayed silent for years, were reconsidering their loyalty to a company that treated everyone as expendable. "They're waiting for a signal," James told Eleanor during one visit. "Waiting for proof that speaking up won't just get them killed. Your survival matters. When people find out you're alive, that you escaped what the company tried to do, it'll change things." Eleanor understood what he meant. Her death would have been a warning. Stay quiet or suffer the same fate. But her survival was different. Her survival meant the company wasn't invincible, that their control had limits, that resistance was possible. On May 15th, everything changed. A telegram arrived at the Mills homestead addressed to Eleanor Whitmore. It was from her father's lawyer friend in Charleston. "Investigation authorized. Federal inspectors en route. Your testimony required. Come immediately." Dr. Whitmore had done it. He'd delivered the evidence, made the case, convinced someone with actual authority to pay attention. Federal inspectors meant real oversight. independent of company influence. It meant Birch Hollow's secrets were finally going to be examined by people who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Eleanor made plans to leave for Charleston immediately. Her leg was healed enough to travel, and delay only gave the company more time to prepare defenses. James wanted to accompany her, but Eleanor refused. "You're more valuable here. When the inspectors arrive, they'll need someone trustworthy to guide them, to connect them with workers willing to talk. That has to be you." They argued about it, but Eleanor won. James would stay in Birch Hollow and coordinate with the investigation. Eleanor would go to Charleston and provide testimony. Together they might actually accomplish what had seemed impossible months ago. The night before Eleanor left, Catherine Mills sat with her on the porch. "You know going back means putting yourself in danger again. The company won't just let this happen." "I know. Your testimony alone might not be enough. Rich men have lawyers who can twist words, create doubt, make victims look like liars. Then I'll make sure my words can't be twisted. I'll speak clearly enough that everyone understands exactly what happened." Eleanor paused. "And I won't be alone. Dr. Whitmore will testify. James will testify. The workers will testify. Together, we'll tell a story the company can't explain away." Catherine nodded slowly. "You're braver than most people I've known. Or more foolish. Maybe both." "Definitely both." Eleanor left for Charleston at dawn, traveling by horse to a town 20 miles away, then by train the rest of the journey. She traveled under a false name, wore plain clothes that made her unremarkable, kept her head down. She couldn't afford to be recognized, not yet. Charleston was everything Birch Hollow wasn't: busy, modern, full of people who had no connection to coal mines or company towns. Eleanor felt simultaneously invisible and exposed. She made her way to the lawyer's office, a modest building near the state capitol, and was ushered into a meeting with 3 federal inspectors. They questioned her for hours. She told them everything: her arrival in Birch Hollow, the conditions she'd witnessed, the documentation she'd compiled, the company's attempts to silence her, the night they'd thrown her down a mine shaft. She showed them scars still healing, described locations in detail, named names. The lead inspector, a man named Morrison, listened carefully. "Miss Whitmore, you understand that the Consolidated Coal Company will fight these allegations with everything they have. Their lawyers will attempt to discredit you, to make you seem vindictive or unstable. Let them try. I have evidence, witnesses, and the truth. That has to count for something." "It does. But truth alone doesn't always win in court. You need to be prepared for a long fight." Eleanor had been fighting since she arrived in Birch Hollow. She was prepared to keep fighting as long as necessary. The inspectors arrived in Birch Hollow on May 23rd. Word spread quickly through the town. Federal men asking questions, examining mine records, interviewing workers. The company tried to control the narrative, but too many people were ready to talk. Years of suppressed anger and fear came pouring out in testimony after testimony. Eleanor returned to Birch Hollow 3 days later, no longer hiding. She walked down Main Street in daylight, her presence making a statement the company couldn't ignore. People stared, some whispered. Margaret Chen ran to embrace her, tears streaming down her face. "You're alive! Thank God, you're alive!" Walter Gaines watched from his office window as Eleanor Whitmore walked through town. Very much not dead, very much ready to testify. He understood then that he'd lost. Not immediately, there would still be legal battles, delays, appeals, but fundamentally, he'd lost. The town he'd controlled through fear and economic necessity was slipping from his grasp. The investigation lasted 3 months. In August, federal charges were filed against the Consolidated Coal Company for safety violations, wage manipulation, and conspiracy. Walter Gaines and 2 company executives were arrested for attempted murder. The company's operations in Birch Hollow were placed under federal oversight. It wasn't complete victory. Companies had lawyers, money, influence. But it was something. It was acknowledgement that what had happened mattered, that Eleanor's suffering and resistance hadn't been meaningless. Eleanor Whitmore testified in the trial that followed. She spoke clearly, calmly, truthfully about everything she'd witnessed and endured. She became, in newspapers across West Virginia and beyond, a symbol of resistance against corporate exploitation. They called her the Crimson Martyr of Birch Hollow, not because she'd died, but because she'd bled for justice and survived to demand accountability. The death that never ended wasn't her death at all. It was the death of silence, of acceptance, of the belief that powerful men could do anything without consequence. That death began the night Eleanor Whitmore climbed out of a mine shaft that was supposed to be her grave, and it continued in every testimony, every exposure, every small victory that followed. Birch Hollow changed slowly after that. The company implemented safety reforms. Wages improved. Workers gained rights they'd never had before. It wasn't perfect, nowhere ever is, but it was better. And that improvement existed because one woman refused to stay silent, refused to accept injustice, refused to die when dying would have been easier. Eleanor eventually left Birch Hollow, but she never really left. Her legacy remained in the town's memory, in the reforms she'd fought for, in the courage she'd inspired in others. She'd come to help people and ended up helping them save themselves. That was worth bleeding for, that was worth surviving for. The Crimson Martyr lived, and in living, she changed everything. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.